Okay, so if the potential to interbreed defines species, reproductive isolation results in new species. So if we look at this picture here, we have yellow flowers here, and then we have purple flowers on the other side. You can see this barrier in between, a land barrier here. And maybe they were same species long time ago, and then something happened, maybe tectonic plates moved, which caused this land to be here in this area, and that caused these species to evolve separately. So the species started evolving separately, and then eventually they turned into two different species. So if there's a barrier that comes in between, that might cause the same one population of species to kind of diverge into two different populations. And later, if this barrier goes away, they might not be able to interbreed with each other because they separated. There's a big difference in between them. Okay, so now we are looking at the type of reproductive barriers that can cause speciation. So we have prezygotic reproductive barriers, and then we have postzygotic barrier. So you guys remember what zygote is? What is a zygote?
Is that like a sperm or an egg cell?
So that's a fertilized egg. Okay, and then two terms we just went over is prezygotic and postzygotic. Prezygotic barrier is something when the zygote doesn't form, happens before. So the zygote doesn't even form, there's something that's preventing from the zygote formation. Postzygotic is when we have a zygote, but for whatever reason, the zygote is not able to develop into the adult, or it doesn't grow if it's a plant. So prezygotic reproductive barriers occur before the formation of a zygote. So we don't have a zygote if this happens. Prezygote reproductive barriers prevent fertilization because we don't have, zygote is a fertilized egg. If there's no fertilization, we're not going to have a zygote. So it's a prezygotic barrier. It's very easy to understand. So we have this table from your book. There are different types of prezygotic barriers. One is habitat isolation. When we say habitat isolation, there's different environments. So ladybugs feed on different plants, and because they're found on different plants, there's a habitat isolation, they don't interbreed. Temporal isolation, active or fertile at different times. So there's this cricket, maybe it's active or fertile during spring, and then another one during summer. So they are fertile at different times of the year, or it can be during the day. Maybe one is at night and the other one is during the day. So temporal isolation. Then there is behavioral isolation. Some animals have different courtship activities. Sometimes they do this dance or they make these mating calls. So you can think of it more of a cultural thing, and maybe one type of species, or this frog makes a mate call and this frog doesn't recognize that call. So in this case, there's no mating that's going to happen because there's a behavioral difference between these two frogs. Even though maybe they might be compatible, but since they don't recognize it, they might not agree to mate. Then there is a mechanical isolation. This is when mating organs or pollinators are incompatible. So last lecture we looked at the flowers that had the heart shape. We also looked at the orchid that had the wasp female that was producing chemicals that were similar to the pheromones of a female wasp. So they were evolving together. They were dependent on each other. Now another wasp species might not be able to pollinate that orchid. So that's a mechanical isolation. When they depend on each other, they maybe the other organisms might be incompatible. So say species use different pollinators here, and then these species use different pollinators. Then there's gametic isolation. Some of the animals, they release their eggs and sperm in water. And there are some chemicals that are found on the, maybe egg surface or the sperm surface. If they don't recognize those chemicals, they're not the same, they're not going to mate. So the egg kind of rejects the sperm or the other way around. So sea urchin gametes are incompatible because there are different chemicals found in each. So that's gametic isolation. All these isolations are examples of pre-zygotic reproductive isolation. And now we're going to look at post-zygotic reproductive isolation. So at this point, now we have a zygote. So we're gonna look at what can prevent this zygote from, maybe becoming an adult. So one thing is reduced fitness of the offspring produced by members of two different species. So it might not live as long to reproduce. How did we define the term fitness, biological fitness?
The ability to survive and reproduce.
Surviving long enough to reproduce. So that's how we defined it. If you Google this word, fitness, you're gonna get pictures that show you maybe physical fitness, and that's where it can get really confusing. Don't Google this word. Think about maybe use your book to get the definition for this. But biological fitness means surviving long enough to reproduce. So surviving long enough to reproduce. I'm just gonna write that. And then in other terms, I would say number. So when you're reproducing, number of copies of genes that are passing to next generation. Number of copies of genes to next generation, and that happens through reproduction. So if there's a reduced fitness, then this organism might not live long enough in order to reproduce. Therefore, these genes are not going to pass. So post-zygotic reproductive areas prevent development of the fertile offspring. And these are some examples. There are not as many as the pre-zygotic, but we have a few. So there is hybrid inviability. So hybrid offspring fail to reach maturity. So here, this hybrid seeds, they are not viable, therefore they're not going to become a tree. So that's hybrid inviability. Then we have sterility, so hybrid infertility. I gave you the example of the mule, and then we have another one here, that's liger, and they're infertile. They live, long enough, but they're not able to reproduce. Hybrid breakdown. Second generation hybrid offsprings have reduced fitness. So if there is an allele in the population that has reduced fitness, then over time it's going to be removed from the population. So offspring of hybrid mosquitoes have abnormal genitalia, and therefore they're not able to mate, and therefore it's not going to stay long in the population. So that's post-zygotic reproductive barriers. Now we are going to define different types of speciation. We have allopatric and we have sympatric. Sym means together. This is a little easy to understand, allopatric. Sympatric's a little bit difficult to understand. So allopatric, there is a physical barrier. You can see this land in between two species. There's a physical barrier. There's no contact between populations. There's no contact between populations. Therefore, they diverge. They evolve independently and they become different species. And this doesn't happen, over a year. It takes millions of years to happen. But that's allopatric speciation. Have you guys heard about pistol shrimp? Pistol shrimp?
Yes.
Eldo, do you know where it's found?
It's like really deep, right? Like they're they can send like a little pulse or like bubble that can like crack glass and stuff. Or I guess kill their prey.
So let me see. So we have this map here. It's not be showing, but anyway, so if you go down here with Mexico, and there's this Panama Canal, and it's separating these two waters. Let me see if I have a better picture. Here. So it's that's really small too. Okay, so that's separating these two shrimp species. So after there was this land barrier, these species diverged and they evolved separately, and now they are not able to interbreed. And this happened after, you know, there was this barrier, but it took a long time. So now they cannot interbreed, therefore they're different species, but at one time they were the same species. But this is an example of allopatric speciation. Does that make sense to you guys? So that's this. There's some land barrier that happened, or it can be water barrier too, but something is separating the species, and over time they, you know, they diverge and they evolve separately. Therefore, they're not able to go back and interbreed. There's no gene transfer between two populations. So there's no gene transfer happening between two populations, and it just kind of diverged, and it just started happening independent evolution over time. So there's its own evolutionary line, and then the genetic differences are going to increase over time, and then we have different two species. So that's allopatric speciation. It's easy to understand. This one is a little bit difficult. This is another example of allopatric speciation. We looked at Galapagos Islands before. So there's this tortoise species. It was also found in Ecuador, but somehow, don't know how, somehow they, maybe in a storm, they got blown to this island. So on this island, the species of tortoise look like this. They have this hood thing here, and they're not very large plants on this island, therefore they don't get stuck. So they live on this island, but another island where there are tall plants and stuff, there is the tortoise that looks like this. So they are considered to be different species. Even if they were left in the same area, they would mate with each other. So they are different species, but it just happened over time. And in this case, these islands are separated by these waters. So this is another example of allopatric speciation. So Galapagos tortoise diverged into several subspecies on different islands. Oh, another thing I forgot to mention, there can be, you know, we have genus and we have species, there can be subspecies and there can be superspecies. So that's when we have, you know, less differences between the species, we call them subspecies, but they're not able to interbreed. Okay, I have a question for you guys. About 3 million years ago, isthmus of Panama closed, forming land bridge connecting North and South America. Snapping shrimp collected from water on one side of the isthmus look similar to those on the other side, but they cannot interbreed. So what happened here, if you were paying attention?